active misinformation in the Western media. I think there's a story you want to talk about how the Western media misreported a recent article in the Chinese magazine, I think it was Qiushi, which reported, quoted past Xi Jinping speeches, and then which allowed the Western journalists to cherry pick and then mistranslate and then misinterpret what Xi Jinping actually said, right? You want to expand on that?
Look, look, I'll add one last thing to your observations about some of those industries that are actively seeking to deepen their engagement in China, and that is in the area of chemical manufacturing. There are German chemical manufacturers that are expanding their operations in China, in large part because they can access cheap Russian gas, which they're now unable to access in Germany. Just saying, I think is how they put it. Look, there was in the last 48 hours or so, early this week, what was it, probably around the 15th, 16th or thereabouts of December, the Chinese Intellectual Journal, the leading journal of the Communist Party of China, Qiushi, which incidentally means seeking truth, right? Seeking truth from fact. It published an article which pulled together some excerpts from 12 speeches and other texts from Xi Jinping on the question of demand and demand management and boosting demand as a critical initiative. And this set of excerpts, and there are 12 of them, run from comments made in 2015 all the way through to comments made in 2025. The comments made in 2015, which of course appeared as the first little set of excerpts, number 1 of 12 in this article, talked about the idea that in the past Chinese production capacity was below par. There wasn't enough of it, and through significant effort it's been built up, and now there is excessive capacity. And so, as you know, there's been this narrative that's been run for quite some time that Chinese exports is because of weak domestic demand. Right? So that's the argument, and that weak domestic demand exists because households are financially repressed, they don't get paid enough, and that there's no social security system which forces households to save a lot, and therefore they don't spend. That's the story. And so the fact that this first excerpt mentions this idea of excessive production capacity was leapt on by a bunch of China watchers in the West as a bit of a ha-ha, there you go moment. But of course, when you read the whole lot, you realize that in fact the remarks that Xi Jinping made over the course of the last 10 years represents a subtle, complex and dialectical approach to this question of production and consumption and investment as part and parcel of this broad question of demand. So the title of the piece, of course, related to demand, Xuqiu, as opposed to consumption, right? So often people confuse these two things. So it was Xuqiu, not Xiaofei. And the reason why this matters is because in macroeconomics, demand actually comprises consumption and investment. So how are we to better understand this body of materials that was published? Well, basically, my view is that you've got to look at it holistically. You've got to treat the whole thing as a body of thought and understand how it fits together, not cherry pick the fact that he talked about excessive capacity in 2015. Because if we did that, we can actually then compare it to what happened after 2015 in any case and realize that 2015, China announced Made in China 2025. production actually increased, consumption increased. So this idea that Xi Jinping commented on excessive capacity back then as if that means something. Well, outside of context, it doesn't mean anything at all. It meant something because, in part, this was off the back of massive government liquidity injections on the back of the global financial crisis. So remember, in the first half of the 2010s, the Chinese government injected something like 400 trillion RMB into the system. Right, this really spurred the whole show on, and that remark in 2015 really was set in that context. So anyway, the whole point of this body of comments that were made is to actually say that supply and demand are intimately integrated with each other. And in fact, there are passages in this body that says supply and demand are inseparable from each other. You need supply to satisfy demand, and you need demand to spur on innovation and supply. And so the question of demand management is fundamentally driven by the idea of investment, particularly strategic investment in high-tech areas, which again is talked about explicitly in this body of excerpts. It talks also about the centrality of government investment, particularly when private investment is a little bit retarded or is not strategically oriented. And it also talks about the need to boost consumption through boosting wages, improving the social security situation. And there's actually another paper from the Peterson Institute of Economics, which actually explodes some traditional myths on that front as well. But basically, Xi Jinping's argument is that supply and demand are intimately integrated. And the real issue that needs to be understood is to achieve and sustain and work towards a dynamic balance, 动态平衡, dynamic balance, through an understanding of the need to promote the dual circulation concept. So this idea that demand and supply are part of a circulation system. And when you get Western commentators or, China watchers in the West leap on one part of this story, it again does great disservice to people around the world, particularly people who don't read Chinese and who rely upon these interpreters to shed light and provide context and interpretive understanding of Chinese public policy thinking. It does a great disservice to all of them when it distorts the fundamental framework that drives China's own way of understanding how to govern macroeconomic variables, supply and demand, and how it thinks about the role of government, markets, innovation, household incomes, and the interactions between investment and consumption. Right? And unless you actually appreciate that through the lens of a Chinese perspective, you'll actually never really understand what on earth China's up to. And if your mission in life is to understand what China's up to, for whatever reasons, but you just want to understand it, and you want to shed light on it so that other people can understand what China's up to and can make sensible decisions around it, you're not helping anybody if you just want to cherry pick bits and pieces that somehow suit your particular narrative agenda. It's just another recent example of how Western tropes are a disservice to the West itself. It's unsurprising, of course, in this environment, how a whole bunch of people sort of start to think, oh, well, used to spend 20 years trying to bat back all of these misinterpretations and distortions. But in the end, what can you do? If it generates self-harm, it's unfortunate for the reasons that I discussed earlier, but people get tired of trying to help guide Western analysts through to a better understanding of Chinese public policy making, and particularly the ways in which Chinese leaders think about and frame the world that they are seeking to understand themselves and then to administer. So,
yeah, especially when they have to read the entire document to look for these specific passages that will conform to their own ideas about China. I mean, this is not misunderstanding. This is strategically missing the forest for the tree. And what Xi Jinping is talking about is actually he's talking about addressing an issue that face a lot of industrial societies today. And whereas they made this into a uniquely like a Chinese problem that finally Xi Jinping is admitting to. And I saw a comment, Arnold Bertrand, who is a French entrepreneur who tweets extensively about China. She actually made a tweet about the exact article. And I was reading through the comments. And one person said, in China, the government treat governance as an engineering problem. In the West, the governance is treated as a messaging problem. I think that pretty much sums it up.
Yeah, look, China, with a combination of a long tradition of viewing the world in holistic terms, coupled with a Marxist tradition, which also views the world in system terms, actually has a way of thinking about the world which understands it as a dynamic process. So the idea is that the world is always in flux, things are always changing, and that in the economic sphere, the aim is you can't stop change. What you can do is guide change. Sometimes you can accelerate change. Sometimes you might want to slow down some change, because as change continues to happen and unfold itself through complex processes and feedback loops, you've also got to try to maintain some sense of dynamic pinghang, balance. And the reason why it's a dynamic balance is to try to get away from the idea that we are aiming to arrive at this static equilibrium state. It's dynamic because fundamentally the world is a process of change. So this is the Taoist traditions together with the Marxist traditions really shedding light on a way of thinking about the world. But if your framework is actually a neoclassical economics framework of supply demand, where time actually doesn't really play a role, then you don't have a way of grasping change. What you have a way of grasping is simply this sense that, well, things are out of kilter, and therefore we've just got to push something to get it back into kilter. And this framework simply looks at distortions, right? The world naturally is equilibrating, so goes the argument. And when it's not equilibrated, we just need to find and remove the distortion. That's the framework that gets brought to this whole story from a whole bunch of mainstream trained China watchers, and they miss the mark. Whether they're right or wrong is, in a sense, a bit different, because what they firstly need to comprehend is how it is that Chinese policymakers actually frame the world themselves. There's no point sort of imposing your view on, the Chinese policy matrix if the Chinese policymakers themselves are actually framing the world in a different way. Right? If you want to understand policymaking in China, you've got to do your best to think like the people who are actually doing the analysis, the people who are undertaking the diagnostics, the people who are evaluating the different prognoses available. There's no point simply imposing a Western neoclassical frame. It's meaningless. And unfortunately, I think you get a bunch of this. And the idea that somehow you can pick one word or one phrase from 10 years ago and try and elaborate an entire trope around it, look, at best, it's a little bit far-fetched. And yeah, look, if you read through the whole thing, look, I actually read it at about midnight my time, because I saw these messages pop up on social media threads, and with this haha, gotcha, told you so, finally admitted, blah, blah, blah. And I thought to myself, this seems a little unusual. So I found the link to the full story, which incidentally wasn't provided by the people who were posting this. Anyway, I found the link to the full story, and I read through it. And I thought, this is just so... It's sort of a willful deceit. It's sort of a self-deceit, because you're ignoring a whole bunch of stuff that you yourself should know if you bothered reading the whole thing. And there's no reason why the people who posted these things didn't read the whole thing. So they're cherry picking. And that's, well, it's deceitful to yourself, first and foremost, and it doesn't help anybody anyway. And I think in the end, it just exposes you to, the charge that you are missing actually the big picture, the real story, by focusing in on, one remark from 10 years ago that was decontextualized.